What would you do if the humiliation didn't end when you walked away? My name is David Harper, and that question followed me long before I understood why it mattered. In that glass-walled meeting room at Brighton Logistics Group, I sat perfectly still while my career was reduced to cells, formulas, and conditional formatting. I remember the way the sunlight hit the table, too bright for a conversation that quiet. Mark Allen didn't look at me when he spoke. He looked at the screen. Anthony Clark didn't look at me at all. He looked at his laptop, fingers resting lightly on the trackpad, like he was touching something fragile and sacred. I replayed that moment often, but it never plays the same way twice. Sometimes I see it as it happened. Sometimes I see what I missed. What I felt was a hollow pressure behind my eyes, like something collapsing inward without sound. What I didn't say could have filled the room. What I pretended not to notice was how rehearsed it all felt. Mark said the word optimized 3 times. Each time it landed heavier. He explained that experience was valuable but inconsistent. Models were reliable, predictable, clean. He said my judgment had served the company well in the past, which was his way of telling me the past was over. I nodded once. I kept my hands folded. I didn't ask why the MBA hire was now explaining my own systems back to me as if they were lecture slides. Inside, something broke loose. I had been there when Brighton nearly collapsed under a North Atlantic shipping strike. I had been there when a Manchester hub lost power mid-December and clients were screaming down the phone. I had been there when no model existed yet, when judgment was the only thing between chaos and collapse. Those moments weren't on Anthony's spreadsheet. They never were. And they never would be. I remember thinking, absurdly, that I should defend myself, explain the buffers I'd built, the quiet adjustments I made at 2 a.m., the relationships I maintained so penalties became conversations instead of lawsuits. But I didn't. I stayed calm, too calm, the kind of calm that looks like agreement. That was my first mistake. The disturbing detail didn't reveal itself until weeks later. At the time, I thought the restructuring was sudden. Necessary. I told myself it was impersonal. Then I found the internal email thread by accident, forwarded to me by someone who didn't realize what it was. The decision to remove me had been discussed months before that meeting. My inefficiency had been modeled, simulated, adjusted. I wasn't evaluated. I was replaced in theory, long before I was dismissed in practice. By the time they called me into HR, my exit documents were already dated. I walked out carrying a box that felt too light for 15 years. No one stopped me. No one asked questions. In the lift, I watched my reflection and didn't recognize the man looking back. Not angry, not shocked, just emptied, like something essential had been quietly removed while I was still breathing. At home, the numbness settled in. Days blurred. I stopped correcting people when they asked what I did. I avoided former colleagues. I slept at odd hours. The identity I'd built, problem solver, stabilizer, the man they called when systems failed, was gone. Not damaged, gone. And it wasn't coming back in the same shape. Quiet rage is different from loud anger. Loud anger burns fast and leaves ash. Quiet rage settles. It waits. I didn't fantasize about confrontation. I didn't imagine shouting matches or dramatic returns. I imagined systems under strain, deadlines compressing, clients losing patience. I imagined spreadsheets staying green while reality turned red. I watched from a distance as Brighton announced its data-first future. I saw Mark quoted in an industry newsletter. I saw Anthony promoted internally. They looked relaxed, confident, certain they had modernized away their risk. They didn't see me watching. They didn't think there was anything left to watch. What would you do if the humiliation didn't end when you walked away? I started to understand the answer slowly, not as an emotion, but as a calculation, not as revenge, but as inevitability. Experience doesn't disappear when you remove it from a room. It waits, it observes, it learns where the gaps are. And then one night, staring at the email timestamps, the approval chains, the dates that didn't line up, the final realization settled in. This hadn't been a mistake. It had been planned.
I didn't disappear after I left Brighton Logistics Group. I simply stopped being visible.
Silence is mistaken for weakness when people are celebrating. I watched Mark Allen enjoy the attention he'd never earned before. Industry panels, LinkedIn posts about modern leadership, smiling photographs beside slogans about efficiency and courage. Anthony Clark was everywhere too. His spreadsheet elevated to something close to doctrine. Forecasts were shared, charts applauded, the language shifted. They stopped saying clients and started saying accounts. They stopped saying problems and started saying outliers. I stayed quiet. I didn't comment. I didn't correct anyone. I let the narrative harden without resistance. That was the observation phase, the most important phase. From the outside, Brighton looked healthier than ever. From the inside, what little I could still see through old contacts and habits I hadn't broken yet, it was brittle, too clean, too confident. They had relaxed. They believed the hardest decision had already been made when they removed me. Everything after that felt easier to them, lighter, as if risk had been solved. People underestimate what they don't understand. They underestimated absence. I noticed the first weakness within weeks. It wasn't technical, it was human. Anthony's model assumed perfect compliance. No hesitation, no shortcuts, no fatigue. Drivers followed routes exactly. Warehouse staff hit targets consistently. Vendors honored timelines because the contract said they should. On paper, it worked beautifully. In reality, people adjusted constantly, and no one was listening anymore. I didn't interfere. Not yet. The mini-revenge wasn't an attack, it was a nudge. Harrison Retail Corp had been my account, not officially by the end, but relationships don't obey org charts. I'd built trust there over years. Late calls, honest warnings, quiet favors that never made it into reports. When Brighton's new system triggered its first optimization, it shaved margins by tightening delivery windows. On the spreadsheet, it was negligible. In real life, it erased the flexibility Harrison relied on during peak weeks. I knew exactly when the pressure would surface. When Harrison's logistics director called, not me, but an old number that still forwarded, I answered. I listened. I didn't criticize Brighton. I didn't mention Mark or Anthony. I asked questions, calm ones, precise ones. Then I did something very small. I suggested a temporary alternative carrier, not a replacement, just a contingency, one that happened to rely on the old buffers Brighton had removed. I didn't profit from it. I didn't announce it. I framed it as caution. Harrison accepted. The result wasn't dramatic, no headlines, no explosions, but Brighton missed a performance bonus tied to that quarter's delivery consistency. Mark had to explain it internally. Anthony adjusted the model to compensate, adding assumptions that made the spreadsheet more complex and less honest. They felt it, not as pain, as irritation. That mattered. The second weakness revealed itself soon after. Brighton had centralized decision authority. What used to be handled locally now waited for approval because the model needed validation. Delays stacked quietly. Teams argued not because they disagreed, but because no one was allowed to decide. Responsibility blurred. Accountability softened. I stayed invisible. I declined invitations. I ignored rumors that they might reach out. I let them underestimate the distance between calm and harmless. Watching them celebrate felt strange. There was no satisfaction in it, just confirmation. Revenge, I was learning, wasn't about anger, it was about timing. Pressure applied gently lasts longer than force applied loudly. The consequences of that small shift rippled outward. Weston Distribution started asking for explanations, not complaints, questions. Why were delivery windows suddenly inflexible? Why did exceptions require approval chains? Why did every answer sound rehearsed? Anthony began attending more meetings. Mark stopped delegating. The confidence tightened into control. They didn't know why things felt harder. On paper, everything was still green. That's the most dangerous color. I reflected often on what this was doing to me. I wasn't the man I had been at Brighton. I wasn't fixing problems before anyone saw them. I was creating conditions and letting reality do the rest. It felt colder, more deliberate. I wondered how long I could pretend to be harmless if everything depended on it. They thought I'd moved on, taken a quieter role, accepted that the world had changed. They told themselves a story where I was obsolete, and stories are comfortable when they're uncontested. I knew better.
Because while they were optimizing, I still had access. Old documentation, archived workflows, contracts written in language models don't read carefully. I knew where flexibility had been hidden, and I knew exactly what would happen when it was removed everywhere at once. They thought the chapter had closed. I knew it had just started.
Pressure never announces itself. It leaks in quietly, through hesitation, through questions that don't have clean answers anymore. The ripple from Harrison didn't stop where I'd expected. It moved sideways. Weston Distribution noticed it first. Then a smaller European client delayed renewal, citing operational uncertainty. None of it was dramatic enough to trigger alarms, but together it created a hum, low, constant, impossible to ignore once you heard it. Inside Brighton, that hum turned into tension. Mark Allen started calling emergency check-ins that weren't labeled as emergencies. Anthony began revising his models weekly instead of monthly. Every revision added complexity, more variables, more assumptions. The spreadsheet grew, but its confidence shrank. Decisions slowed, people waited, and when people wait, fear fills the gap. I stayed out of sight. That was the hardest part. I still had access to fragments of the company's internal rhythm, not illegally, just historically. Habits don't vanish when roles do. Former colleagues spoke carefully when they called me, like they were testing whether I was safe to talk to. I never offered opinions. I asked how things felt. That was enough. Paranoia crept in subtly. Managers began documenting conversations that had never needed documentation before. Teams copied more people on emails. Anthony insisted on written justifications for deviations, even minor ones. Mark stopped trusting summaries and started asking for raw data. They didn't know what they were afraid of, only that something wasn't behaving the way it should. Revenge changes you if you let it. I could feel that happening. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was anticipating. I wasn't angry. I was precise. There were moments I caught myself enjoying the distance, the way I could influence outcomes without being visible. That frightened me more than the betrayal ever had. I reminded myself what had been taken from me, not just a job, a future trajectory, authority earned slowly and lost instantly. That loss didn't fade, it sharpened. Then time pressure entered the equation. Brighton had a major renewal approaching, a multi-year North American contract that required proof of operational stability. Audits, performance guarantees, client-side analysts reviewing Brighton's last 6 months in detail. On paper, they would pass, barely. In reality, the buffers were gone. Any disruption would expose the truth immediately. I knew that, because I had designed the old buffers. The fear inside Brighton shifted from vague to specific. Anthony started asking questions that should have been asked months earlier. What happens if 3 delays overlap? What if a vendor renegotiates mid-quarter? What if a regional hub misses one target by a small margin? The model answered confidently. Reality didn't. Mark called me for the first time then, not to ask for help, to test the water. A casual message. Hope you're well, just checking in. I didn't respond. Silence is louder when someone is already uneasy. How long could you pretend to be harmless if everything depended on it? That question followed me as I reviewed something I'd kept deliberately untouched until then. An archive folder. Old escalation protocols, clauses in contracts that allowed clients to demand manual overrides in specific circumstances. Circumstances Brighton's new system no longer recognized because they weren't quantifiable. The catastrophic part wasn't that Brighton didn't know these clauses existed, it was that they had no operational pathway left to honor them at scale. 1 request could be managed, 2 would strain them, 3 would expose the system entirely. I didn't trigger anything directly. I didn't need to. The pressure was already there. Vendors were negotiating harder. Staff turnover increased slightly. Enough to matter, not enough to explain. Every small human variable Anthony's model had smoothed out was returning at once. Anthony started staying late. Mark stopped smiling in public appearances. Their confidence shifted into defensiveness.
They spoke about external factors and temporary adjustments. The language of certainty was gone. I watched myself closely during that period. I noticed how calm I was, how little sleep I needed, how focused my thoughts became. Revenge wasn't consuming me, it was organizing me. That was the most dangerous realization of all, because by then I wasn't guessing anymore. I knew exactly where the breaking point was, and more importantly, I knew I still had access to the one thing that could push everything past it.
The moment revenge becomes visible is never the moment it begins. It's the moment denial finally runs out of space. By the time Brighton realized something was wrong in a way that couldn't be explained away, the damage was already moving faster than their meetings. It surfaced first in places no spreadsheet liked to look: client calls that ended too quickly, follow-up emails that arrived colder than expected, questions that weren't accusatory but investigative. Publicly, nothing had collapsed. Internally, everything was tightening. I stayed calm, almost unnaturally so. While Mark and Anthony scrambled to explain fluctuations, I watched the consequences surface exactly where I'd always known they would. Regional managers began pushing back, quietly at first. "We need flexibility. This isn't how it works on the ground." Their concerns were acknowledged, documented, and ignored, because the model still said everything was fine. That disconnect was the fracture line. The first visible consequence landed when Weston Distribution escalated formally, not a complaint, a notice, a request for compensation tied to clauses Brighton hadn't triggered in years, clauses that required manual judgment, rapid exception handling, and relationship-based negotiation, all things the new system had optimized out. Anthony tried to handle it through adjustments. He added override layers, conditional logic, more cells, more color. The spreadsheet grew bloated, less readable, less trusted. Teams stopped understanding why decisions were being made, only that they were being delayed. Mark attempted authority. He called meetings, set deadlines, demanded confidence. But authority without clarity only produces fear, and fear makes people cautious. Caution slows everything. That was when he confronted me. Not directly, not professionally. He called late, pretending it was casual. His voice carried a strain he didn't bother hiding anymore. He asked if I'd heard anything, if I'd noticed market changes, if I had any thoughts, purely informal, of course. I listened. I said very little. When he finally asked why I was being so quiet, I answered honestly. I told him I was no longer responsible for outcomes there. Silence followed, the kind that feels like someone realizing a door has locked behind them. What Mark didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this wasn't a reaction. It never had been. The plan hadn't started after my dismissal. It had started long before that meeting room, back when I'd built redundancies they called inefficient, when I'd documented failure scenarios they'd skimmed, when I'd warned, politely, repeatedly, that systems without judgment don't break loudly, they erode. Even my exit had been accounted for. I'd ensured certain relationships remained personal, not institutional. Certain understandings were verbal, not automated. Certain protections required human recognition to activate. Brighton removed the humans. The consequences accelerated. A North American audit flagged inconsistencies, minor ones, enough to delay approval. The renewal window narrowed. Internally, blame began shifting. Anthony argued the data was sound. Mark argued the execution was failing. Managers argued they were trapped between impossible targets and rigid approvals. And still, I remained outwardly detached. I attended unrelated meetings, took consulting calls, lived a quieter life. No one could point to anything I'd done wrong. That's the power of inevitability. It doesn't need fingerprints. Anthony tried intimidation next. He reached out through a mutual contact, suggesting I'd been talking, hinting that interference could have consequences. I met the implication with polite confusion, asked what he meant, asked for specifics. He had none. Because there was nothing to accuse. What they felt What frightened them was the sense that control had slipped beyond visibility, that outcomes were no longer traceable to decisions, that the system they trusted was producing results they couldn't explain. That's when panic truly set in. Emergency protocols were discussed. Consultants were mentioned. Costs rose quietly. Morale dipped quietly. Staff turnover ticked upward again just enough to matter. Each small loss compounded the next. I felt no rush, no triumph, only certainty. Because by then, the final trigger had already been set in motion, not by me calling anyone, not by leaking information, but by allowing 3 specific client-side requests, perfectly legitimate, contractually protected requests, to align in the same quarter. Requests Brighton no longer had the operational capacity to honor simultaneously. Nothing dramatic would happen all at once. There would be no single explosion, just a sequence of failures too connected to dismiss and too dispersed to stop. As I watched the first internal memo circulate, carefully worded, quietly alarming, I understood something fully for the first time. This couldn't be stopped anymore. Not because I wouldn't stop it, but because it was already done.
By the time the pressure reached its peak, there was no single place it lived. It was everywhere at once. Emails unanswered just long enough to be noticed. Meetings that ended without decisions. Numbers that technically added up but felt wrong in the room. This was the phase where everything could still collapse. Not just Brighton. Me. The 3 client-side requests landed within 10 days of each other. Each one was reasonable. Each one was contractually protected, and together they demanded exactly what Brighton had removed from its system: human judgment, rapid exceptions, and trust-based negotiation. On paper, the response paths existed. In reality, they were dead ends. Anthony pushed the model harder than ever. He stopped asking whether it reflected reality and started demanding that reality comply. Overrides stacked. Manual workarounds were attempted by people who'd never been allowed to practice them. Mistakes multiplied, not because anyone was incompetent, but because the system had trained them not to think outside its boundaries. Mark stopped sleeping. That wasn't rumor, that was fact. I heard it in his voice when he called again, this time without pretense. He didn't ask for help. He asked if I could meet, just to talk, neutral ground, no obligations. For the first time since my dismissal, I hesitated. Walking away then would have ended everything quietly. Brighton would still struggle, but they might stabilize eventually. Another consultant would patch the gaps. Anthony would learn, slowly. Mark would survive, bruised but intact, and I could return fully to the life I'd been building in parallel. That was the moment I almost lost control. Because revenge, when it reaches this stage, stops feeling righteous. It feels heavy. It asks for payment in parts of yourself you didn't plan to give. I questioned whether I was still reclaiming dignity or simply proving I could destroy something I understood better than anyone else. If winning meant becoming someone you no longer recognize, would you still finish? That question didn't have a clean answer. Not for me. The plan nearly unraveled when one of the clients hesitated. A delay, a reconsideration. If they pulled back, the alignment would break. Brighton would regain breathing room. Weeks of pressure would dissolve into manageable damage. I didn't intervene directly. I did something smaller, riskier. I clarified expectations. A single call, no instructions, no persuasion, just a reminder of rights already written into the contract, a calm explanation of what Brighton had committed to and what timelines legally required. I didn't exaggerate, I didn't threaten, I let the language speak for itself. The client proceeded. That was the last reversal. From there, events accelerated beyond anyone's control. Brighton's response time slipped past acceptable thresholds. Internal escalation loops jammed. Authority conflicted with process. Anthony's model contradicted itself in edge cases he'd never considered. Mark approved exceptions that violated the very framework he'd defended publicly. The cost became undeniable. Financial penalties, reputation damage, internal fractures. Employees began quietly updating resumes. The illusion of control collapsed faster than anyone expected once it cracked. And then Anthony realized. Not all at once, in fragments, a pattern he couldn't model away, a variable he couldn't isolate. He traced decision paths backward and found gaps that weren't errors but absences, human absences, judgment he couldn't recreate because it had never been written down. He understood who that judgment belonged to. Mark called one final time before everything broke into daylight. His voice was stripped of authority, of pride. He said my name like it was a question he already knew the answer to. He didn't accuse me. He didn't need to. They finally saw it. Not as sabotage, not as betrayal, as consequence. I felt no relief in that moment, no satisfaction, just exhaustion, the kind that comes when something long and deliberate reaches its end. Because the most dangerous part of revenge isn't planning it, it's surviving long enough to watch the truth become unavoidable.
Collapse doesn't arrive with noise. It settles in, quietly, like a decision everyone avoids naming until it's already final. Brighton Logistics Group didn't fail overnight. It unraveled in a way that felt almost polite. Mark Allen resigned first. The announcement framed it as a personal decision, a line polished enough to suggest dignity. Inside the company, everyone understood what it meant. Authority had run out. Confidence had expired. He left without ceremony, without confrontation, without even a farewell email that mattered. Anthony followed weeks later. His departure wasn't voluntary. The internal review didn't accuse him of incompetence. It was worse than that. It concluded that the systems he'd championed were insufficiently adaptive to real-world variability. A clinical sentence, bloodless, permanent. His reputation didn't explode. It evaporated. Recruiters stopped calling. Panels stopped inviting. His name became associated with a case study no one wanted to be remembered for. The company survived, barely. Clients returned slowly, cautiously, under revised terms that restored manual judgment and local authority. Consultants were brought in, expensive ones. Systems were rebuilt around principles I'd argued for years earlier, now presented as rediscovered wisdom. No one mentioned my name in official documents. They didn't need to. The shape of my thinking was everywhere. When Mark finally asked me to return, it wasn't as an employee. It was an admission. He didn't try to negotiate aggressively. He didn't pretend leverage. He asked what it would take. I told him calmly. Consultancy terms, limited scope, clear authority, no exclusivity, no illusion of permanence. He agreed without hesitation. When I walked back into the building, no one clapped. No one avoided eye contact either. They watched me the way people watch a structural engineer after a collapse. Not with affection, not with resentment, but with relief that someone understood why the ground had given way. I rebuilt what could be rebuilt. I stabilized what was salvageable. I didn't fix everything. That wasn't possible. Some losses don't reverse. Some trust doesn't return in the same form. But the bleeding stopped. The panic eased. Reality reasserted itself. Anthony's spreadsheet was still there. It always would be. But now it was a tool, not a judge, not a shield, not a replacement for human awareness. Decisions were argued again. Adjustments were made in real time. People were allowed to be uncertain and responsible. I never raised my voice. I never referenced the past directly. I didn't need to. What I had lost was never fully recoverable. 15 years inside a single identity doesn't transfer cleanly. I didn't reclaim my old role, my old trajectory, or the version of myself who believed loyalty and experience were enough. That man was gone. What I reclaimed was control. Control over how my judgment was used, control over my time, control over the silence that once felt like erasure and now felt like power. I no longer needed to be visible to matter. I no longer needed titles to validate what I knew. The moral revealed itself without announcement. Patience outlasts arrogance. Silence exposes fragility. And people who are underestimated rarely need to announce when they stop trying to survive.
I watched Brighton from a distance after my contract ended. It moved forward, chastened but functional. Mark took a smaller role elsewhere. Anthony faded from the industry entirely. No public reckoning followed, no dramatic justice, just consequence, distributed unevenly, like it always is. Sometimes, late at night, I think back to that meeting room, the sunlight, the folded hands, the calm nod that looked like surrender. I understand now why I didn't speak. I wasn't giving up. I was stepping back far enough to let inevitability do the talking. The loudest revenge I ever took was saying nothing.